They spoke up for their child. The school called the police. But what happened next turned the whole system upside down and exposed a truth no one was ready for. Jamal used to be a cheerful 10-year-old boy, full of energy, curiosity, and laughter. But lately something about him had changed. His parents, Monique and Darnell, noticed he barely spoke at the dinner table, often kept his head down, and no longer smiled like he used to. Every morning became a struggle. Jamal would drag his feet, avoid eye contact, and sometimes even fake being sick just to stay home. At first, Monique thought he might be overwhelmed with schoolwork or tired, but deep down, she sensed something more serious. One night, after tucking him into bed, she sat beside him and gently asked, "Is someone at school bothering you?" Jamal hesitated, his small hands clutching his blanket. Then he finally said in a low voice, "They laugh at me. They say my skin looks dirty, and my teacher didn't even stop them. She laughed too." Monique's heart dropped. She called for Darnell, and as Jamal repeated what happened, his father's face turned to stone. The pain in his son's voice stirred a storm of emotions, hurt, anger, and fear. They had always known racism existed, but they never expected their little boy to face it this early, and especially not inside a classroom. The next day, Monique sent an email to the school, explaining what Jamal had told them and requesting a meeting with the teacher and the principal. There was no response. She tried calling but kept getting transferred or disconnected. After several attempts with no reply, Monique and Darnell made a decision. They would go to the school themselves and demand answers. They weren't looking for a fight. They just wanted their son to feel safe and respected. But as they got ready to leave that morning, neither of them knew that standing up for Jamal would lead to something far more shocking than they could ever imagine. What started as a simple visit would soon spiral into a moment that exposed the very heart of a broken system. Monique and Darnell arrived at Lakeside Elementary early in the morning, hoping to meet the principal before classes began. They walked through the front doors with calm determination, holding hands tightly, their minds focused only on protecting their son. When they reached the main office, the secretary looked up and asked if they had an appointment. Monique explained that they had emailed and called several times but received no response, and they needed to speak with Principal Cartwright urgently about a serious issue involving their son. After a brief pause, the secretary disappeared into the back. A few minutes later, Principal Cartwright walked in with a stiff smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Please come in," she said curtly, leading them into her office. The moment they sat down, Monique began explaining Jamal's experience, the bullying, the racist remarks, and how a teacher had laughed instead of stopping it. Her voice trembled, but she stayed composed. Darnell added that Jamal was now afraid to go to school, and they were extremely concerned. But instead of showing empathy, Principal Cartwright crossed her arms and sighed. "I think your son may be misunderstanding some things," she said, flatly. "Kids joke around. You have to understand not everything is meant to be harmful." Monique's eyes widened in disbelief. "Joking about his skin being dirty? That's not harmless," she said firmly. Darnell leaned forward, his tone calm but serious. "We're not here to argue. We're here because our son deserves to be treated with dignity." That's when the principal's expression hardened. She stood up and said, "If you continue with this confrontational attitude, I'll have to ask security to intervene." Monique blinked, shocked. "Confrontational? We're just trying to talk." But Principal Cartwright had already picked up the phone. "I'm calling the police," she said coldly. Darnell stood up, stunned. "Are you serious right now?" She didn't answer. Moments later, they heard sirens in the distance. What should have been a simple meeting for justice had turned into something else entirely, something ugly, unjust, and deeply alarming. Within minutes, the sound of approaching sirens echoed through the quiet school halls. Monique and Darnell stood frozen in disbelief, watching as Principal Cartwright calmly waited by the door. They had come to speak up for their son, but now they were being treated like criminals. Two police officers entered the front office, their hands resting near their belts as they scanned the room. "We got a call about a disturbance," one of them said. Monique immediately raised her hand slightly, her voice steady but hurt. "We were just trying to speak to the principal about our son facing racism in school," Darnell added. "No threats, no shouting, just concerns about our child's safety." But Principal Cartwright cut in sharply. They were becoming aggressive. I didn't feel safe. The officers exchanged glances. They asked the couple to step outside the office. As they walked out, teachers, staff, and even a few early students saw the scene unfolding. Some whispered. Others simply stared. Monique fought back tears. Darnell kept his head high, though his jaw was tight with anger. Jamal, sitting in his classroom, had heard the sirens and peeked out the window. The moment he saw his parents surrounded by officers, he felt his heart break. Tears streamed down his cheeks as his classmates looked on, confused. He wanted to run to them, but his teacher told him to stay seated. That day, Jamal didn't just feel unsafe. He felt invisible. Outside, the officers finally realized there had been no actual threat or disturbance. They asked Darnell and Monique to leave calmly, saying it was best not to escalate the situation. "This is already escalated," Darnell replied bitterly. They walked to their car in silence, knowing their voices had been dismissed simply because they dared to demand respect. That night, they sat at home, shaken and humiliated, trying to explain to Jamal why speaking up for what's right had brought them shame instead of justice. But deep down, they also knew this wasn't over. Something needed to change, and they were no longer afraid to push back. The next morning, Monique's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. At first, she thought it was just family checking in after the horrifying incident at the school. But when she opened her messages, she saw dozens of notifications, links, screenshots, and videos. Someone had recorded the entire moment the police arrived at Lakeside Elementary. The video captured everything: the calm way Monique and Darnell spoke, the principal's cold reaction, and the officers escorting them out as if they were a threat. The person who recorded it was Ms. Hernandez, a young teacher's aide who had been quietly witnessing how the school treated certain families differently. She had sent the video to a local journalist and shared it on social media with a simple caption, "This is how Black parents are treated when they stand up for their child." Within hours, the video exploded online. People across the country were shocked by what they saw. Comments flooded in, expressing outrage, sympathy, and demands for accountability. Hashtags began trending, and news reporters showed up at Monique and Darnell's doorstep, asking for interviews. At first, they hesitated. They weren't looking for attention. But then Monique looked at Jamal, who was watching the video quietly on his tablet. "They're listening now," he said softly. That was all she needed to hear. The couple agreed to share their story, not for themselves, but for every family who had been silenced or ignored. The local school board was overwhelmed with pressure. Parents, teachers, and community leaders demanded an emergency meeting. Many were shocked to learn that Jamal wasn't the only child who had been mistreated. Several other parents came forward with similar stories, complaints dismissed, children labeled as difficult, and issues buried. The video had not only exposed one incident, it had cracked open a system built on silence. Meanwhile, Principal Cartwright remained silent, refusing to speak to the press. But the walls were closing in, and everyone could feel it. What started as an ignored complaint had now turned into a national conversation, and the truth couldn't be hidden anymore. The pressure on Lakeside Elementary and the entire school district became impossible to ignore. After the video went viral and public outrage grew, the school board held an emergency town hall. The room was packed with parents, students, teachers, and community leaders, all demanding answers. One by one, families began to speak. A mother shared how her daughter had been punished for defending a Black classmate. A father recounted how his son was labeled disruptive for simply asking questions in class. The silence that had protected the system for so long was finally broken. The board announced that Principal Cartwright had been placed on immediate administrative leave, pending a full investigation. The teacher who mocked Jamal was removed from the classroom indefinitely. But Monique and Darnell weren't celebrating. They knew this was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, the district launched mandatory anti-racism and cultural sensitivity training for all staff. A new parent-led advisory council was formed to oversee complaints and school culture. Monique was invited to co-chair it. Darnell, once angry and quiet, now spoke at public events, encouraging other parents to stand up without fear. Jamal slowly began to heal. With the teacher gone and a new, caring educator in her place, he started smiling again in class. His confidence returned little by little, and he no longer dreaded going to school each morning. But what mattered most wasn't just Jamal's smile. It was what his story had sparked. People began paying attention. Policies were being rewritten. Voices once ignored were now at the center of the conversation. Monique and Darnell had never asked for fame or headlines. All they had wanted was justice for their child. In speaking out, even when the world tried to silence them, they inspired a wave of change far greater than they ever imagined. And though their journey had started with pain, it ended with hope. Not just for Jamal, but for every child who deserves to feel safe, seen, and heard in the place they're meant to learn. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts. Subscribe to Deep Wounds for more powerful real-life stories that deserve to be heard.